I'll start with the backstory. If you want to go, let's go back to 2017 when we first romantically met there at the Austrade event. What did you see at the ecosystem then? I think quite famously in the local sense, invested in Coinbase back then, when most people probably would have told you, I assume, this is nothing but the darknet and scammers. So start there. What did you see back then? What were the opportunities as you sort of observed them to be?
So we did our first investment in Coinbase in 2014, and I guess what we saw back then was, we basically pitched into Westpac, hey, you should start up a fund because finance is going to get disrupted. We said that to every bank actually, and they all laughed at us, but Westpac said, okay, sure, and gave us some money to go and throw at it. And what we saw then was, we'd come out of media and we'd seen how disruption worked in media and how it didn't just, become something that media companies had to engage in. It decimated media companies. Let's be clear, like it's brought them to their knees. And we felt that that was the process that was going to go on in finance, and we were looking for what was going to do that. And when we, I guess when I bought my first Bitcoin in 2013, it was very clear that, oh yeah, this is what's going to do that. And it was just that notion of the programmable immutable ledger. Bitcoin is a piece of software that started back in 2009, I think, and has been running continuously without stop ever since. That is a remarkable thing, and it is now unstoppable. It's literally a piece of technology that will, unless the world blows up, will be running probably continuously into the future. And that is now true of probably a number of other blockchains as well, Ethereum, etc. So that is it's actually a tectonic shift that I think so few people have really grasped when they're involved in a kind of mainstream existence, that this is just an entirely different way of technology operating. And to the extent that we as individuals can have a place, can have some sort of part in that ledger, it actually empowers the individual so incredibly. That was the future that we saw. It's the future that does bring institutions, I think, actually brings institutions to their knees on all levels. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think they just get eroded because hopefully they become largely irrelevant. I think the big question, sorry, and I'm jumping around here, but the big question that remains for me is, what we saw with the hope that came. I was doing venture capital in 2000 as well, back in the dot-com era. And, we had all the big vision. Everyone had all the big visions about what was going to exist, It just took another 20 years for them actually to exist. But what we didn't understand, there was a lot of optimism and hope, and we didn't understand the evil that can come with a level of institutionalization and bureaucracy. I think we've really seen that writ large in some of the sort of social media stuff that's going on, et cetera, and how these institutions can be manipulated and manipulative. And I think, one of the things that comes with great power is great responsibility. We as individuals are having all of the power handed back to us. The question is, do we have the maturity and the consciousness to be able to carry that forward and create a beautiful, productive, great planet to live on? Or are we going to destroy ourselves with that power? And I think that remains an open question. But, I think that's the challenge for us all. Personally.
So you saw that in 2014?
Well, sorry. So yes, some of those questions about, what do we do with this technology? They become more and more clear over time. I think they've become more clear with what we've seen happen in Web 2 and how the negative effects of how that's played out in some ways.
So we're in 2022.
Yeah.
And this event speaks to saying to people the mainstream moment is arriving in some way, shape or form. Yeah. You look at it and say it's clear as day. I look at it and say it's clear as day. It's coming. It's on either side of that that stage of the process. How is it still the case that so few of the people that you deal with, and within the VC community as well, your peers largely were absent? I know that, again, as far as startups that had the opportunity to be funded, it was cold pass. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It was. They didn't even get a meeting.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's
from that
interesting.
perspective-
I mean, to that end, like, so we invested. We tried to. Well, I shouldn't tell this story out loud, but we did invest in the Series A round of Immutable back in 2018. We were the first Australian investors, and the first Australian institutional investors, and they pitched. I mean, we actually met them very early on, but for whatever reasons, challenges in the way we operate, couldn't participate in the seed round. But they pitched to every VC in the country back at a VC event in New Zealand. No one else except us invested. So everyone saw them. Like, no one can say, oh, no, didn't even see Immutable. No. They all saw them. So one of the things I think about disruption is, a lot of innovation is not disruptive innovation. And one of the things that's quite weird about disruption, I think catches people by surprise, is that most fundamentally disruptive technologies actually start as a really bad version of what already exists. So if you look at the classic example of the transistor radio, all radio sound quality at the time was brilliant, okay? And all the companies competed on sound quality. But a radio was the size of a fridge. A family could only afford one. It sat in the lounge room. You listened to the BBC because mum and dad controlled what station you listened to, right? Transistor emerges. The transistor creates the possibility of this thing that can sit in your pocket that a teenager can afford that sounds terrible. And everyone was very dismissive of it because the sound quality was so bad. But there was a fundamental shift. Suddenly, teenagers were empowered with their own ability to listen to whatever the hell they wanted to listen to. And that revolutionized the planet. I mean, rock and roll music emerged from that. It was a total revolution. And so people don't understand that disruptive innovations are usually often a poorer quality version of what currently exists. So everyone's like, but it's a terrible financial system. It's slow, I can lose my keys and da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, it is. But if you're stuck in a country where you can't take money out or where you're being oppressed and you need to get across the border, it's a fucking awesome financial system, right? And this is the point, is that disruptions extend to people who currently don't have access to the existing quality, to teenagers who didn't have access to the radio, to people in countries that don't have access to a good financial system or even a stable government with a stable currency. This is where these things start. And now we're also seeing is providing access to artists who've had no connection to their audience. And now suddenly they have the ability to connect directly with their audience and to continue that engagement after the artist left them. So this is the disruption. It might look terrible to the people who are masters of the existing industry, but actually for the people who've never had access to that, this is life-changing.
And that period of time that was the ICO boom sort of window, were you active in that window? My view is, so many of the views of the people who don't like the ecosystem were formed at that time. They formed a view, we don't like it, it's a room filled with scammers, and they have not resolved from that position. How do you see that now as a historical window?
Well, that window was when we did the Immutable investment. We didn't invest in an ICO because we weren't able to invest in an ICO legally. I actually think, I think people get jaded by the ICOs and probably not unfairly because, there's a lot of terrible behavior goes on in all of this sort of stuff, right? But I also think it's probably one of the most profound innovations because what we're seeing is the ability, my industry, VC, is being disrupted. It's being disrupted, let's be honest, right? The walls have come down. So, we sat here on, I think it was Tuesday. I was sitting at home with my son who had COVID, but I'm fine, so you don't have to worry about that. And, watched as the bankless guys, who are probably the biggest media in crypto, interviewed a handful of Australians, knew them intimately because they're a group of Australians who are now global leaders, global players in this space. That's not been true in previous it's only just becoming true in Australian venture that we're sort of starting to get recognised. Starting to get recognised in that sort of way. What's changed? I think the talent has always been here. What's changed is the capital walls have just come down. And suddenly it doesn't matter where you're from. And I think that's actually one of the mindset shifts that people need to have if they're coming into the crypto space and you can see why it's such a fundamental mind shift, because you see, I mean, the mycelium guys walking out of university and now they've got global capital chasing them and they're just sort of everywhere. If you need to come out with that mindset of I'm now in a global space, like I'm not limited in any way, shape or form, and I need to think of myself like that. And if you do, then it will open up incredible opportunity. And I think this conference has been an extraordinary display of Australian talent, but also the extent to which the gatekeepers have lost control of the gates. They've been blown open, and now everybody has access to capital if you've got some beautiful gift you want to bring to the world that you can do through a blockchain.
And is there any particular catalyst in an Australian context? I think we probably share the view. We seem to be nowhere. I mean, when I took on the role as CEO of BA, we largely were nowhere. I sort of felt that the puzzle pieces were starting to come together. Was there anything in particular that you saw where you thought this has now given us at least a chance to play a material role in a global sort of sense?
I think these things are very small. I think they're just by small steps. I mean, this is the other thing about disruptive innovation. It starts worse. And, at the moment, it's only useful to people in countries, that don't have a decent financial system. But it invariably gets better and better and better and better and better over time. We wouldn't even think about using a vacuum tube radio now. The technology wouldn't come anywhere close to a transistor radio. All of that stuff has just improved over time and completely outstripped the old technology. And blockchains will do the same. I would say by the end of this decade, we will look at the financial systems. I mean, we already do look at the financial systems we deal with. When I get my text saying your bank will be down between the hours of these times, so please don't do anything, I'm like, really? What world do we live in? When I'm asked by the 1,000th person to give my unique identifier, the 1,000th random anonymous call center person in some country who now has all my personal details, so it could be me to somebody else. There's now 1,000 people every year who could come and pretend to be me. That's a good system for protecting my identity. I mean, the system's actually terrible on a whole bunch of levels, let's be honest. And all of this stuff, it's so exciting to hear all of the small fixes. So what's changed? It's all these just small improvements, these all small incremental things. Hearing about ZK, zero knowledge, KYC, I'm just like, thank God someone's doing that. Yes, that needs to happen. But just all of these small improvements, I think that's what's shifted it. There's no doubt that the government shift, and I think this is absolutely a testament to the work you've done, your team have done, and all the people that you've corralled in the community, and to Senator Bragg, to give credit there as well, that, there's been some real work to go, oh, actually this does matter. And we do need to take this seriously. And I never would have believed I would have heard that speech that I heard from Jane Hume talking about how Web3 was going to bring down Google, Facebook, and I'm like, okay, bring it, let's go. She's obviously been reading Sovereign Individual and she's all about it. So, I think the government has thrown down the gauntlet in this space, and I think that is a testament to the work that the community's done to get the government on side.
It's a funny thing that the backstory on the government side, which is odd, is Senator Bragg didn't know much about this space. He acknowledges that was the case. You talk about sort of serendipity of moments. It wasn't do we try to influence the Liberal Party and try to shift their views. When I took on the role, it happened to be the case, chance. He'd already committed to doing an event about cybersecurity with Blockchain Australia. And I just said, who's that? What's happening here and who's responsible? That was it. There was no marvellous plan. He was just willing to show up and talk about it. And so that's for me, we look back and say, well, these things are obviously connected to your point, Simon, but that was it. He was there to talk about cyber and go home. Yeah. And here we are X amount of time later. So when people say to me, what's your view? What's the difference going to be if the Liberal Party versus the Labor Party? I said, it doesn't matter because of this. Now, the point is, in the face of politics, the aim of this week was put as many people in the room as possible, surface the greatest people in the space in this country, and if either side of politics thinks this isn't something we should be doing, then I'll happily pack my shit up and leave as well at some point in time. It makes no sense. So that's sort of been the power of this general conversation, is just put good actors in a room, and if politics gets it wrong, then I've done my bit to say here's an opportunity. Don't pass it up. When you look now at where we are. How do you see it playing out? As in outside, I'm talking the politics side, back to sort of the tech now. When you go, what's the macro view of the way this technology plays out? Knowing that there are all sorts of geopoliticals and issues at play, you're looking at it, whether it's from an investment perspective or otherwise. What do you see as the sort of the next phase of this development?
Well, I mean, I do tend to see, I probably am a bit of an extremist. I think it's one of the things you have to be a little bit sometimes when you're investing in startups. You know, they talk about strong views weakly held. You have to have a vision for where you imagine the world might be in 10 years. So, you know, I watch it the way that this little economic model of these sort of micro communities that can go and raise capital resources through their own tokens, etc. I think it is empowering a million little cuts to some of the institutions that we currently operate in. I think that they will, over time, become, you know, that we will be living in a Web 3 where it's essentially displaced Web 2, that the institutions of Web 2, which rely on these massive economic moats, you know, these two-sided networks, which are absolutely unassailable, unless you can incentivize everybody who's going to win out of sieging the compound. And if you can incentivize everyone who's going to win, which is everybody, then you can bring those behemoths down. And I think that that's the way that ultimately happens. But, you know, the other things that excite me are, you know, the innovation in democracy, which, you know, Katrina was talking about, but, you know, seeing them happening in DAOs at the moment. You know, I think that's the other thing that's clearly broken in the world, is that democracy, as it's working currently, is, I think, really struggling at the moment. And part of the problem is that our old model of democracy is a constant win-lose, you know, and you see it in the US, you know, it's red team, blue team, and every 4 years a new team gets its daggers out and tries to kill everybody who's on the other team. That model is just problematic. It doesn't work with the human condition. And, you know, I loved at the conference hearing about the Ethereum cat herders who are basically running around trying to build consensus and the thing about a consensus is not how do we compromise and make a worse thing. It's how do we build everybody's wisdom and intelligence into the next improvement proposal that's going forward in order to ensure that it can get up, but that it can also be as good a proposal as possible. So these are new innovations in democracy and in decision making that I think are so profound and will ultimately displace some of our existing democratic institutions at some level as well. So I think it doesn't just change the economy. I think it changes government. I think it changes everything.
So some rapid-fire ones then. Do you think, is there too much money on its way into a VC-style environment? Too much money chasing too few deals?
I don't think there's ever too much money going into VC, certainly not in this market. You know, I think that whether VCs are going to, you know, whether VCs, I think it's fine because I think that money will ultimately go into the ecosystem, and eventually the ecosystem will become more and more self-funding. You know, ultimately it's made a lot of entrepreneurs and others wealthy who are now investing into the ecosystem and are much probably better stewards of that money at some level because they've got empathy with the people they're investing in. So, you know, I think that this process just continues to roll like that, and I think that it's good.
From a privacy perspective, is there two sides of the same coin there? Do you think we regain our privacy, or do you think our privacy is perpetually lost now? Where's your optimistic or otherwise bias in relation to what this technology can do?
Yeah, I do think I think that's a really interesting, that's a big unknown for me. Because, and it's also a big conundrum for me, I have to say as well, because on the one hand, I'm a massive believer in privacy, and I think that bureaucratic creep is a problem. And by that, you know, this constant bureaucracy only extends further and further into our lives. It never retreats. And, you know, people talk about what's gone on in Canada with blocking truckers' accounts and so on. And, you know, using the financial system as a weapon against the citizenry, that's a problem. You know, whatever you think about it, that's a problem. So, you know, even digital KYC, this sort of zero-knowledge KYC, I think it's probably good to the extent that it doesn't further that weaponization. I think ultimately that weaponization, you know, will be called out at some point, and people won't put up with it at some point of the financial system. I think that we are going to get our data back, and I think that's absolutely critical and fantastic. Like, I think there's going to be more privacy. The only thing that's going to be on the ledgers is anonymous movements of funds and capital, and that's fine.
I think that's it. I think you've just concluded Blockchain Week 2022 for us, Simon. I appreciate you closing the loop.
Thank you, Steve. Hey,